Hello, beautiful souls, and greetings from the Center for Contemporary Mysticism in Philadelphia. My name is Joe Irwin, and it's a joy to gather with you again to explore this amazing journey that we share. We have a great program for you today, which you're going to love. But first, I always like to take a moment and welcome folks to the Center, particularly if anyone is new. If you're new to the Center, we invite you to check out our website. It's simply contemporarymysticism.org, and there you'll find lots of videos of past speakers and programs, also groups in which you may participate weekly or monthly, and lots of other resources. So check it out. It's contemporarymysticism.org. Remember, our goal is to be a partner with you on your spiritual journey. So if you feel what we're doing is important, we invite you to join us, get involved, support in whatever way you feel called, and help us continue the work that we do together. Now, it is a pleasure to welcome our guest for the day, John Philip Newell. Dr. Newell is joining us from Findhorn in northern Scotland, and he is a world-renowned Celtic spirituality teacher, as you may know, founder of the School of Earth and Soul, which was formerly the School of Celtic Consciousness. He now considers himself a wandering teacher, which I love that term. It's following an ancient tradition of Celtic teachers for centuries before him. So today he teaches in the United States and Canada and Europe, and also leads pilgrimage weeks at the International Ecumenical Community of Iona on the Isle of Wight in Western Scotland. Dr. Newell is author of 15 books. Today we get to explore his newest book entitled Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, Celtic Wisdom for Reawakening to What Our Souls Know and Healing the World. So John Philip, welcome to the Center. It's our honor to have you here, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
Thank you, Joe. Very good to be with you.
We also welcome back our own Patricia Pierce. As you know, is not only an interviewer extraordinaire, but she's a former pastor, a spiritual teacher, and a host of the We Awakening podcast, which you should check out. It's excellent. She also is host of a number of companion groups for those participating in the global transition taking place today. So remember that a little bit further down the line, we will have a Q&A session, as we usually do for those joining us live, where if you think of a question you might have during the interview, make a note of it so that you can click on raise your hand and come on and have a chance to dialogue with Dr. Newell face-to-face a little bit further down the line. So we'll look forward to that. But we're so glad to have you here, John Philip. And Patricia, at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, John Philip, for joining us. I just want to reiterate Joe's enthusiasm for having you with us. And I've really been looking forward to this conversation about your latest book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. And when I was reading this book, and my ancestry is primarily Scottish, English, Irish, but Scottish primarily. As I was reading this book, I felt like gongs were going off inside of me, gongs of recognition, of relief. And I wonder if you get that reaction from a lot of people when they become perhaps reacquainted with the wisdom of their ancestors.
Yes, absolutely. And Patricia, it's very good to be with you. Thank you for the welcome. I tell a story in the book that I'd like to repeat in response to your opening question. Many years ago, I was giving a talk in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a church in Lynchburg, Virginia, on some of the central themes of Celtic wisdom. I was accessing parts of the prologue of John's Gospel, and especially that night, the words that refer to the true light that enlightens every person coming into the world. And I was speaking of the first historically recorded teacher in the British Celtic context, Pelagius, as saying that when we look into the face of a newborn child, we are looking into the face of God, freshly born among us. And of course, Pelagius is not just speaking about the newborn child, he's speaking about what is deepest in every human being, made of God. At the end of the evening, and I was contrasting that to the doctrine that has dominated so much of our Western Christian thought, namely the doctrine of original sin, which has wanted to say that what is deepest in us is opposed to God rather than being of God. But at the end of my talk, a woman in her 80s, I believe, came very purposefully up the central aisle of the church with a copy of my latest publication, which at that stage was Listening for the Heartbeat of God, in which I explore these themes. And she was coming up the aisle so purposefully that the naughty boy in me thought, I think she's going to hit me over the head with that book. And I was quite wrong, thank God. When she got up to the front, she said, I want to show you what I wrote in this book after reading it. And she opened the cover, and inside I saw that she had written, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. And I so often wish I had asked her for that copy. Because I think she said so simply and so succinctly what our deep experience is when we hear wisdom or truth that has been neglected. We may never have heard it before. It may never have been taught to us. But when we hear it, there's this deep resonance or this deep gong, as you're speaking of. I knew it. And one of the other reasons I wish I had asked her for that copy is that if I had, it would be with me now, and it would be with me every time I teach, because my sense of what I'm trying to do as a teacher and what our invitation is to do for one another as spiritual friends or spiritual accompaniers is simply to try to give expression to what is already in the soul of the listener. And I think that is the true mode of teaching, that our role is to be awakeners or to be articulators of what at some level the soul deeply knows. And that's part of where the subtitle for the book comes from, is this sense of how can we set free? The model that has dominated so much of our Western Christian inheritance has been, we have truth, you don't, let us generously tell you what it is. A very sort of triumphal approach to truth. And I think that's a false stance to take. And I think that one of the things this approach does is to invite us into a place of humility, even when we're trying to articulate. What we're trying to do is not give voice to something that isn't already deep within the listener. We're simply in love, trying to be part of awakening one another, with a realization that awakening has big consequences in how we live, how we view one another, how we act.
Yeah. And this allowing that essence within us to be reawakened, or that knowing within us to be reawakened, it is a knowing that was squelched over the centuries, and we can talk more about that in a moment. How it is that this Celtic wisdom became suppressed. But before we go there, I would love to have you just articulate, maybe in broad brush strokes, the essence of Celtic spirituality, Celtic wisdom.
Thank you. Yes, I see it as being characterized by two very interrelated themes, but they're distinct enough to mention separately. The first is the belief that earth is sacred, that everything that has come into being has come into being from the essence of the one from whom we'll call the one that we call God, if we're to use a word to speak about the unnameable one. So it's to say that everything has come forth. I mean, one of the earliest teachers, and I spend a bit of time on him in the new book, Irenaeus of Lyon, in the 2nd century. So this is extremely early. This teacher, Christian teacher from the Celtic territory of Gaul, ancient France. He says, everything comes out of the substance of God. And I mean, this is a word that still shocks our dualistic Western ears. We've been so trained to see spirit on the one hand, matter on the other. But Irenaeus says, like all of the great Celtic teachers after him, creation doesn't come out of nothing. The sort of doctrine of creation ex nihilo that was put forth by imperial Christianity in the 4th century and following, all with a view to, in a sense, neutralize matter. It's to say, well, God fashioned matter out of nothing. So I think once matter is neutralized in our minds, then we begin to think, and of course empire loves to think, that we can do whatever we wish to the matter of the earth. So that's the first point, and of course it is sounded at the very beginning of our Hebrew scriptures, at the end of the 7-day story of creation. God sees all that has been made, and behold, it's very good. It's all sacred. And then the second related theme, very much interwoven with that, is the belief that what is deepest in every human being is of God, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Or to put it so simply and radically as someone like Julian of Norwich does, she says, we are made of God, not simply made by God, we are made of God, which again is to say that we come out of the very womb of God. And that's one of the reasons why I think Julian so loves to refer to God as mother as well as father, because she sees us as coming out of the very essence of the one. A number of years ago, pre-pandemic, I was giving some talks on these themes. Again, as it turns out, in Virginia, I'm not always in Virginia. That's just where some good stories come from. But at the end of my talk, when I was speaking of the love of John's prologue, which begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John goes on to say, and everything has come into being through the Word, which is to say that everything is essentially an expression, an utterance. You are a unique and unrepeatable expression of the one. Each one of us is. But at the end of the talk, a man came up to me and said, is there a connection between the word utter and the word uterus? And I said, wow, I think you're onto something. And the next time I could do some etymological digging into that word, sure enough, our English word utter comes from the Old English utera, which comes from the Latin uterus, which is a beautiful way of remembering that each one of us is not simply, again, fashioned out of nothing, but that we come out of the very substance, or the uterus of the divine. So it's those twin themes, the sacredness of earth, sacredness of the human soul. And it's about waking up to that sacredness in ways that radically challenges how we see one another, how we view the deepest energies of our being, how we're called into interrelationship with one another as people, as races, as species.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up another facet or aspect of Celtic understanding, which is reverence for the feminine, which also became suppressed in the imperial Christian tradition. So who were the Celts? I found that part very interesting in your book, because we tend to think Celtic is limited very geographically. And I was very interested to learn that originally the Celts spanned a great distance in Europe. So can you just fill us in on that?
Yeah. In sort of 500 BCE, just as the sort of Roman Empire was really moving into expansionist form, at that stage, the Celts spanned the whole of Middle Europe, ranging from places like Galatia, close to modern-day Turkey, Galatia, which just means the land of the Gaels, the land of the Celts, right through to the Atlantic coastline of Spain, to Galicia, again, land of the Gaels, land of the Celts, included Gaul, ancient France, land of the Gaels. So while today, when we speak of Celtic culture or Celtic spirituality or the Celtic races, we tend to think of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany. But that's just the edge. That's the fringe, the sort of remaining fringe of what at one stage was a network of tribes, of peoples that spanned the whole of Middle Europe with a common language base and many shared features to their culture. And even before that, I mean, we were speaking briefly before we came on live here about an event I was doing last night in Findhorn, a live stage performance of Celtic spirituality, really telling the story of the people of the Western Isles and Scotland, speaking about the richness of that tradition, but also how it was decimated through the Highland clearances, and a glimpse into what has happened and what keeps happening to native people and to native wisdom, the threat to native wisdom throughout the world. But a part of what we're exploring in that live stage piece last night, to me, is very exciting, because it explores the linguistic roots between Gaelic and Sanskrit. And those linguistic roots are very strong. Gaelic is closer to Sanskrit than it is to any European, sort of modern European language. So it speaks of this ancient connection, the sort of Indo-European movements of people in prehistory. But I do feel that something of India's sense of the sacred universe can be heard again and again in the ancient prayers and poetry of the Celts.
Yeah, so last month our guest was John Perkins, who has done a lot to form relationships and alliances between people in North America and the indigenous people of the Amazon to try to help protect the rainforest. And there is this, this desire of European descended people in North America, certainly, to look to indigenous peoples for some sort of spiritual richness that we have lost. But as I was reading this, I was just so keenly aware that what you are describing is the indigenous wisdom of of my ancestry, and many of us who are, descended from Europeans. And so this ability to tap back in and to recover that indigenous knowing that became suppressed, I think there's something tremendously empowering about that. I presume that you experience that in the work that you do, like people finding their roots again.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, Patricia. And this is part of my interpretation or understanding of why there's so much resurgence of interest in Celtic wisdom in North America. it's much more accentuated there than it is in Scotland, even. And I mean that's a tragedy. It's tragic that Scottish Christianity is so little accessed Celtic wisdom. I think it's a wonderful thing that there's a resurgence and awareness happening on your side of the Atlantic, and that's what I'm very much in relationship with in so much of my teaching and writing, engaging with that sort of desire to reconnect with the native wisdom of the Celtic stream. Part of my understanding is that many men and women of the Christian household in North America have become aware of the wisdom of the Native American tradition, or the First Nations wisdom in Canada. And in the context of that awareness, I think many have said, do we have something similar in our own stream of inheritance? And I think that connection is a significant aspect of, and accounts for why there's such a depth and breadth of interest in the Celtic in the United States and America. And the same is true for so many people from Australia and New Zealand as well. I think they've been aware of Maori wisdom, of Aboriginal wisdom, and they've said, is there something resonant to that or similar to that in our Christian inheritance? And that's exactly how I see the Celtic. I see it as an expression of native wisdom.
Mm-hmm. And what was it when the Christ story first arrived? In your view of things, what was it about that felt so resonant and familiar, and sort of like an amplification of this knowing that was already held among the people, the Druidic tradition and so forth?
There's a lovely account of a 6th century Irish bard saying, when he became aware of the Christ mystery, he is reported to have said, there was never a time when Christ was not our teacher. We simply didn't know him by name. So there was a deep sort of recognition of Christ's wisdom that happened in the Celtic world. And I think that's why there was such a radical continuity between the pre-Christian and the Christian, and why people like Columba of Iona in the 6th century refer to Christ as their Druid. And why so many of the great Celtic teachers in the early centuries insisted on continuing what was known as the Celtic Torture. It had been the Druidic priestly or teacher hairstyle, as opposed to the Roman tonsure, which was shaved up on top with a ring of hair around it. And people like Pelagius in Rome was much criticized for his hairstyle, because he arrived in Rome looking like a pagan, basically looking like a Druidic teacher. And this wasn't just a statement, a fashion statement. This was it was a way of deeply honoring the wisdom that had preceded Christianity in the Celtic world, and a way of saying, in a sense, that pre-Christian Druidic wisdom, this awareness of the harmony of the heavens, of the spheres, this awareness of the healing energies of earth and holders of herbal wisdom, this deep reverence for the feminine, and this model of often having women in leadership, someone like Bridget of Kildare in the 5th century. It seems that she was the head of most significant Druidic community in Ireland, and she also brings her Druidic wisdom directly into her devotion to Christ, the Christ mystery. So a deep resonances, and there's a sense of ancient truth being fulfilled or coming to greater expression in the Christ figure. And I think one of the important things, of course, to say about the Christ figure, sometimes when we speak of the Christ figure in much of our Western Christian inheritance, we're thinking very limitedly of a sort of Christ figure sort of outside of ourselves. And what comes across in Celtic wisdom is that each one of us is being invited to access our Christhood. That's not to inflate ourselves. It's to say that deep within us is this intermingling or conjoining of the divine and the human. So Christhood refers to that marriage of the divine and the human that Jesus is celebrated as being a memory of or an awakener of, but he's seen not as embodying a truth that is foreign to us, but rather embodying and disclosing a truth that we've forgotten or that we've fallen out of relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And your book traces how it's the primary teachers and leaders and creatives in this Celtic tradition attempted time and time again to stand against what was happening with Christianity as it became more and more of an imperial religion and more, I would say, devoted to the idea of original sin, the desacralization of earth. And for me, so I graduated from seminary, ordained in the Presbyterian Church, similar context as yours. And when I was in seminary, we learned about Pelagius as, the heretic and all, so there's this way in which this attempt to stand in the truth of our original goodness, to stand in the truth of the sacredness of the earth, to stand in the truth of the reverence of the feminine, all of this was time and time again squelched. And these thoughts were, the attempt was made to banish these ways of thinking, but of course, just the fact that we're sitting here having this conversation today says that has been a futile attempt. So talk to us more about this, this overtaking of Christianity with an imperial frame of mind, and how it is that you believe that some of these doctrines that have been so inculcated in us have served empire.
Yeah, a really important question. So I think part of what we're being invited to do is to imagine what was happening in the 4th century. Our Christian tradition moves from being a persecuted religion into being religion of empire. And it happens really quickly. And so our brothers and sisters in the Christian household at that stage must have been so relieved to be free of persecution. But a price was paid for becoming religion of empire. Because, we know the phrase an inconvenient truth, and empires don't want inconvenient truths. It's not convenient to an empire that wants to dominate and dictate and subordinate whenever it's convenient to empire. I'm speaking about the Roman Empire in the 4th century, but we know how empires behave. That is, countries that want to exert domination and control of the rest of the world. We know about the British Empire we know about aspects of the American empire. So what empires want is religion that will sanction their domination. So it was not convenient for empire, and I think this is one of the reasons why someone like Pelagius, I mean, it's interesting, he was banned from the empire before he was even excommunicated. And so what was that ban about? What was empire frightened of in Pelagius's teaching? And I think it was not convenient to empire to have a Christian teacher like Pelagius teaching that the wisdom of the divine is to be found deep in every human being, that the face of the divine was to be found in every human being, and a full celebration of the feminine, the sacred feminine face of the divine. He was a disturber, and really offering teaching that had radical implications for a deep honoring of every human being and a deep honoring of the feminine. And then, of course, there's the correlation, which I spoke about briefly, as early as someone like Irenaeus challenging this doctrine that was gaining ground even before the 4th century, but which really came to the fore in the 4th century, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Empire doesn't want to be told that matter is sacred, and that how we handle the body of the earth with reverence and justly, that's not convenient to empire. So again and again, I mean, nearly all of the new book has 9 chapters, looking in each chapter at a significant teacher, prophetic figure. And it's a very consistent story. They were all excommunicated, banned, judged as heretics, accused of pantheism. The story is very consistent, and I think it comes down to the radical challenges that result from this recognition of the sacred at the heart of one another and the earth, and is the challenge now, and this to my way of seeing and believing is why the Celtic holds such a rich treasure of resource for this moment in time. There are many great spiritual wisdoms to access, and I'm not saying we access only the Celtic, but the Celtic is a significant resource for this very moment, in terms of how we view the earth and one another.
Mm-hmm. One of the stories that you include in your book is the story of the suppression of many of the cultural expressions by, in this case, the Scottish Reformation. And I have to tell you, John Philip, I wept when I read the part about people being forced to destroy their fiddles and their flutes. I just wept at this suppression of this, just the natural expression of people's aliveness. Mm. Now, you have for a very long time been very involved with the Iona community, and Iona is sort of a pilgrimage place, a central location for the continuation of this Celtic understanding. Can you talk to us about Iona and what it means to you?
I think it's the second to last figure in the book. I think it's chapter 8. I give to George MacLeod, the founder of the modern day Iona community. And I see George as very much standing in this stream of great prophetic teachers around sacredness of earth, sacredness of every human being. And in George, it particularly took the expression of non-violence, both non-violence of action, but also non-violence of heart. And I love that aspect of the Celtic. I was noting that one of the prayers, and many of these prayers that had been passed down in the centuries, over the centuries in the Western Isles, people were forbidden from using these prayers. They were forbidden from speaking Gaelic, and that went along with the burning of the pipes and the fiddles. I mean, I sometimes refer to the Scottish reformers of the 16th century, and then the sort of 17th century neo-Calvinism as being like the Scottish Taliban. It had the sort of violent suppression marks of an extremist form of Islam as well. And George MacLeod sort of stands very much in this tradition, and he makes the radical application of this spirituality to nonviolence and to his passionate work for justice in the inner cities of Glasgow and different parts of Scotland. So that was a sort of modern day resurgence of Celtic wisdom in and through Iona in the person of George MacLeod. But Iona has again and again over the centuries been a sort of well of wisdom, to be a wellspring place, a place that's been accessed again and again. And we've spoken briefly already about the sacredness of the feminine. And in my researches a couple of years ago, I came across an ancient Iona prophecy. I haven't been able to date its century of origin, but it appears to be a very ancient Iona prophecy. And that prophecy states that just as the masculine face of the divine shone very beautifully to us in Jesus, so the feminine face of the divine will come to us through Iona. And on that day, says the prophecy, the world will know peace. This sort of beautiful recognition that what we are being called into within ourselves and between ourselves is the dance of the feminine and the masculine, allowing these two expressions of the divine to make love, or to conjoin, or to intermingle within us all, both as men and as women, but also within our communities, within our nations. And I mean, think of how so much of our Western world has been dominated by a form of shadow masculine energy, arraying itself up over against the earth and often against the feminine. And that's not accidental. The way the earth has been abused and subordinated is again and again, tragically, the way that the feminine has been abused and subordinated and exploited. So Iona has had this place historically, and I think that places people, I mean, I often sort of ask myself, why are we becoming so aware of Bridget again, this 5th century Irish saint? And my sense is that figures, places, teachings have a way of coming up into our consciousness again when we desperately need them. And part of what we desperately need at this point is the profound intermingling of masculine and feminine expressions of the divine. And Iona's played its played its part in that. And that's not to pretend that there hasn't sometimes been reaction to the celebration of the feminine, even on Iona. But that's true of one of the things George MacLeod used to say is, where's the turbulence? Where are things unsettled? Go there, because something is trying to be born. Something's trying to sort of come forth more clearly and more powerfully. So Iona has had its own turbulent times in relation to not fully or deeply enough celebrating the feminine, but historically it's a place that keeps shining with that note.
And you lead pilgrimages to Iona, and what do you see people experience when they go there?
Yes, I'm such an unabashed evangelist for Iona. I mean, and this is based on my own life, my own times of deep transformation and challenge in and through periods on Iona. But I get to see it again and again in the lives of so many pilgrims. And there are many aspects about Iona. I'd like to speak to a couple of them. One, I remember an Irish priest friend of mine said after he first experienced Iona, he said, Iona has something of the freshness of the first day of creation about it. And so I think that there is something about Iona that carries this immediate sort of fresh sense of the birthing of earth, sea, and sky. And George MacLeod was the one that first called Iona a thin place, and by that he meant that there's a thin separation between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, on Iona. And he wasn't thereby meaning that every other place is thick. He was meaning that Iona is sort of like an icon, or into which we're being invited to look and step and experience in order to remember the thinness of every place. Some places are much more challenging in which to see the immediacy of the divine, or the light that shines from deep within all things. So time on Iona is like this renewing of our inner perspective, a washing of the lens of the heart, that we may see that shining in one another's eyes and in everything that has being. The other aspect of Iona that I'd like to touch on briefly relates to one of the rules by which the community of Columba lived in the 6th century. And one of the beautiful things about the Celtic stream of wisdom is that there was no hierarchy. There was no sort of central hierarchy. So the Celtic Christianity didn't have the equivalent of Rome and a bishop of Rome or a pope insisting on uniformity across the church. The pattern that emerged in the Celtic world was more like families of monastic communities. So there was the family of Bridget monasteries, and there was the family of Columba, and there was the family of Patrick and Brennan. And there's a sort of family likeness between these expressions. But each monastic community had its own sort of unique features. And one of the unique features of Columba's monastic community in the 6th century was prayer. until the tears come. Pray until the tears come. This recognition that when the tears come, something very deep in us is stirring. I love what Carl Jung says about tears. He says, when we weep, something in the salt sea of life's origins is moving again. And I have witnessed and I've experienced the gift of tears on Iona. So many people have said to me over the decades, when I first stepped onto the island, people will say to me, I began to weep. And there's something about this place that invites a washing of the inner lens. And you know what it's like when we do sort of physically weep. It's as if everything is sparkling. It's sort of seeing almost the landscape becomes sea washed. It sparkles like diamond. And so I see this in Iona. And what is it about a place like Iona? Because it's important to remember that Iona was a holy island before Columba in the 6th century. It was a Druidic holy island. So what comes first? I mean, is it the special sort of thinness or intersection of particular energies in a place like Iona that leads it to be cherished and celebrated? Or is there an accumulative energy in a place where people have prayed and wept in getting in touch with what is deepest? I'm never quite sure. I feel it's probably a combination of the two. And because Iona is not an easy place to get to, you know, and no one happens to pass through Iona. It's not on the way. It's not on the way. Any
trains and buses and ferries
That's
and
right.
buses and yes.
Yeah. So I think, you know, by the time people arrive, they've done a lot of letting go, and of course that's a blessing when we have let go of many things before arriving for a pilgrimage week on Iona. Then in my experience, people are open. They're ready to receive, and maybe that's part of where the tears come from. And that's not to say that the tears, you know, always come at the beginning. Sometimes it's sort of well into a week after a lot of intentionality about meditation and prayer and engaging with teaching. But I think it is a very beautiful aspect. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the tears we've often been quite frightened of tears in our culture. Sometimes in so much of our Western world, it's been seen as almost a shameful or an unmanly thing to do. And I think, again, maybe this is part of the beautiful feminine energy of Iona, inviting us to be more attentively aware of the interrelationship of all things. So many things could be said about Iona. I love what Nan Shepherd, who wrote a beautiful book called The Living Mountain, in which she allows the mountain of the Cairngorms to be like this metaphor for earth, and she sees it as living, and everything on the mountain is part of the mountain, not just the geological form, but the creatures, the cloud formations, the people walking in the mountains. And she speaks about body knowing, knowing with our bodies. And I think Iona is one of those places that invites that as well, knowing not just with our head, but also with our heart and our bodies as well.
Mm-hmm. And you, as you have said, you have joined the Christian diaspora in that you relinquished your ordination in the Church of Scotland because the doctrines do not reflect your understanding of the sacredness of the earth. And I'm wondering if this Celtic understanding meets people. I think, there's so many people who would say, yeah, they're part of the Christian diaspora. People who have left the church because it's not meeting them where they are spiritually. Do you find that when people do learn about a Celtic understanding of Christianity, that they feel like they've come home and found what it was they were looking for and were not finding in the institutional church?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always felt quite passionately is that a wisdom tradition like the Celtic, as part of our Christian household, it's not there as an alternative. It's not about setting up another church. So that I've never seen the Celtic in those terms at all. So in relinquishing my ordination as a Church of Scotland minister, I did not feel the way forward was to set up another church, the Celtic Church. So that my prayer is that we may learn to access Celtic wisdom in ways that will transform us as individuals and communities, but can also be offered to the heart of our Western Christian inheritance. I mean, I think that we come from a tradition that is always celebrated, certainly in its scriptural testimony. It's celebrated the prophetic. And the prophetic tends not to speak from within the four walls of religion. The prophetic tends to speak from the wilderness or from outside. But it speaks with love to the heart of its own tradition and people. So in relinquishing ordination, I didn't see it primarily as it wasn't a judgment of those who have not relinquished their ordination. And many of my best friends in Scotland and around the world continue to be in church ministry, and I honor them. I admire the important work that they're doing in their communities, and often in their wider communities of justice work and care for the earth. So my action was taken very much with a sense of integrity. As a teacher, I felt it was inconsistent to be calling myself a reverend of the Church of Scotland when I simply cannot recite the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed or the Westminster Confession. So it was more important for me to relinquish that so that I could more explicitly try to be part of giving voice to what we're yearning for in the diaspora. Because there are millions of men and women who in the Western world today who began life within the four walls of the Christian tradition, and tremendous numbers of them can no longer enter the four walls. They're not being fed. They're not being addressed. They're not. Their deep yearnings in relation to earth, in relation to the feminine, in relation to a deep honoring of other wisdom traditions. These yearnings are not being addressed in so much of our religious inheritance. So whether one is choosing to do the dedicated and a faithful continued work of trying to bring change from within, or whether one is doing often the much sort of lonelier work out in the wilderness and not having the same shape and container for community and for a sense of self-definition. Whether one is within or without, I think we can be working for the major sort of rebirthing of Jesus' wisdom for this moment in time, and we can be part of bringing healing within our Christian inheritance, as well as any offerings that we may make to the world.
Thank you. So, John Philip, I want to make sure we allow time for questions. And before we totally wrap up here, I just want to let people know that they can learn more about you and your work at earthandsoul.org, right? And they can sign up for a newsletter that will let them know where you're teaching and what sorts of programs you're leading and any new books that might be coming out down the road. So that's where people can find you, earthandsoul.org.
Before I let you go, I want to tell you about our next program. Comes up in 6 weeks on May 1st. This is going to be a very special program because it is our first in-person program for those in the area in 2 years. And but it will also be fully hybrid. And so that means those who are in the Philadelphia area or Mid-Atlantic, if you're visiting Virginia, John Philip, you can pop in. But it's for anybody in the area to welcome to come in person, and then it'll be fully hybrid for all our many friends and members across the country and around the world. And it will be Chelan Harkin. She is a wonderful young woman who's a mystic poet. There are a lot of rising poets today, I think, but she, more than many I've seen, really captures the mystical poet tradition that has often been compared with Rilke and Hafez and these others. And at the same time, she's a mom of young children. And so it's going to be an excellent program. She's coming from Washington State, and she's going to be talking about mysticism, the mess of being human, and the courageous and vulnerable journey of living an authentic life. I think it's going to be very exciting. So mark your calendar May 1st, and you can register to come and be with us in person or register as we've done today online. So mark your calendar. So John Philip, what's next for you? I think you even have another pilgrimage at Iona coming up later this month, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. This will be our first pilgrimage since the pandemic began 2 years ago. So we've had 2 years of having to postpone physical gatherings on Iona. So yeah, we're looking forward to convening again for our first resuming of pilgrimage.
Well, that's wonderful. We wish you all the very best in your upcoming work, and hope you consider yourself a member of the Center family, and would love to have you back at some point. In fact, I'd like to think of talking to you when you're in the United States sometime about doing a contemplative retreat in our area. So lots of things to consider. If you want to know, Patricia already mentioned this, more about the work of John Philip, you can go to his website at earthandsoul.org. And also his book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. We encourage you to check that out, which you can do on our website. We participate in the bookshop.org, which is a online bookshop for nonprofits and organizations such as us, and it helps raise money for independent bookstores and nonprofits, and you can get it right on our website if you go and click on the CCM bookstore. So check it out. Obviously, it's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the other places. So it's a wonderful resource, and we hope you'll check it out. So thank you so much, everybody who's here, and John Philip and Patricia. And we will say now, until we meet again, be safe, be well, and remember that you are perfect just exactly as you are. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Blessings.